everyone, and welcome to the session today. My name is Penelope Milner, and today I'll be talking to Samantha Suppiah about the climate crisis and in particular the decolonial perspective on that. So I will now run a short clip just to introduce you, and then we will run and go into the introductions for the talk. Thank you, everyone. Amazing. So thank you for being with us this morning, Samantha. Samantha is a very inspirational person. She is the co-explorer of possible futures, a sustainability strategist for Urban Donut, and she has a really keen interest in sustainability and regeneration. Just a brief introduction for me as well. I'm a geography student currently at the University of Leeds, and I'm also really interested in climate change and the climate crisis, hence I wanted to get involved with the Festival for Change today. So thank you so much, Samantha, and I'll hand over to you now for 5 minutes for a short introduction, and then we'll run and go into some questions from the audience. So thank you very much, Samantha. I'll hand over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Penelope, and to all the organizers for inviting me to share my perspectives with you all. So in this 5 minutes, I just wanted to point out to some very sort of brief things, and there's also reference documents that I'll provide later on in the chat when it's time. But just to open, apparently we are currently facing a planetary crisis. Just what is this crisis that we are experiencing? Is it a climate crisis? Is it an environmental crisis? Is it a consumption crisis? A technology crisis? A governance crisis? A cultural crisis? What is this crisis? We can say it's late-stage capitalism, or it's industrialized globalization. It's our industry of neoliberal optimism, the opium industry. We can say it's patriarchy and white supremacy within our global and state institutions, or it's unmitigated urban growth and its efficiency at rapidly draining rural resources. We can say it's European colonization and world domination through imperialist military conquest and economic warfare. In a war they are waging so successfully that us privileged folk in the global south are not only complicit, but indeed enthusiastic in decimating our own indigenous and traditional ways of life. We can say the crisis is the invention of the corporation, particularly the multinational corporation. The biggest, most important invention the Dutch ever gave the world was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. We can say the crisis is the invention of the state. We can say it's the agricultural revolution and the invention of the city. We can say it's our narcissist, egotistical contemporary consciousness. We can say it's civilization itself. All these things are built upon one another, they interdepend. We, humanity, we are sick. It's our dominant cultural evolution that's making us unwell. Somewhere along the way, we took a terribly wrong turn, and here we are millennia later, blindly strolling to hell in a handbasket on a road lightly, unstably paved with a greenwashing of good intentions. So what is the crisis? It's your crisis. What is the crisis to you? Looking at the shockingly monotone narrative dominating sustainable development at any level, local or global, you'll hear a lot that this crisis, whatever it is everyone's responsibility. We must all do our part. Or that we can all sit around a campfire telling stories about this single altruistic vision of human progress and togetherness. Our acceleration of societal collapse into a never-ending World War III is sorely missed by the global north and folk in sustainable development and regeneration, as they encourage global south folk who are experiencing life-threatening systemic oppression to kindly join them in holding hands and singing songs about reducing carbon emissions through regenerative agriculture as ecocide and ethnocide rages on around us. This is the very core of the narrative that I want to speak about, because this comes from colonial hegemony that seeks to forgive itself in your eyes, for the inequalities it itself has created in our worlds, to distract you from the behavior of those with real power in our global system so as not to disrupt their plans for accelerating capital flight from the global south to the global north. Colonial hegemony, the fantastic salesperson that it is, has long ago wormed its way deep into our minds, our bodies, and cultures through the centuries. So how did we come to hold this eco-fascist idea of sustainable development? It's all part of the machine to uphold and maintain colonial power structures. Colonization is about two things: genocide, killing people, and the ethnocide, killing ways of life, that decimates our way of going back. The reason for this is to conquer, to rule. This is done to control. Control is necessary to ensure continued profiteering through resource hoarding. Ethnocide is an efficient tool in constructing global hegemony because you no longer have to kill people to perpetuate your agenda. You simply have to kill their cultures, their spirit. This is why we have terms such as the global south and the global north. We are not the same. The global south's shared history is one of genocide and slavery by the global north. European invasions all around the world committed genocide and ethnocide everywhere, destroying natural and human worlds again and again and again. European world domination through 600 years of war, rape, and slavery cemented the cultural foundations of global institutions of the 20th and 21st centuries. This is the nucleation and proliferation of the one world, the ontological parasite that seeks to invalidate and exterminate other worlds. That's all I can cover in 5 minutes. And I have a bunch of references for you as well. They're available at bit.ly/samsrefs, bit.ly/samsrefs, and I believe they're being shared as well in the chat. Thank you, Penelope.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that introduction. I had goosebumps, so it was really powerful. And yeah, so if anyone has any questions, then do keep them coming into the chat. I just had something, this is quite a broad question, just to respond to what you said, and, as we're probably all aware, there are a lot of problems with the world and lots of things that we have to tackle and face in order to, try and get out of this crisis that we're all in, and try and do something to make sure that we protect future generations and that they still, we still have a human race, So I was just wondering, what is it do you think that we do now to kind of get out of this in response to those issues? If you had like an action plan, what would be those kind of first steps that you take to try and resolve this?
So for me, and this is what I say to people a lot, your action plan should be number one, burn your action plan. Whatever it is that you think you're doing, stop it. We need to be really focusing on how we got here, trying to understand that, understand what was wrong about it, or unhelpful, or leading to ethnocide and ecocide, and then trying to undo that within ourselves. So for some people, it might look like, a process of going back into my ancestral history or whatever. And for other people, it might be through studying, supply chains and how extraction works and who makes money off of this entire system and how it's being perpetuated, right? For other people, it's a spiritual affair. It's coming back in touch with sort of your own kind of deep knowing, in a sense, of what is wrong and what is disconnected, and how to then start to bridge those gaps. So action plan is to throw away the action plan. That's the first thing. But the second thing is also then, what do you look into? How do you inquire? And so for me, there's really two areas where I think it's necessary to start kind of more deeply looking at. So the first is the things that I already spoke about, right? How colonization continues to control the ways that we organize ourselves on this planet, be it part of our culture, part of our economic systems, or part of our political sort of, run-ins, let's say. And the other part of it, I think, is also asking ourselves, what roles do we play in this? Do those roles need to change? Or is there something about how I show up in the world that I would actually like to be different? So there is no action, really.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to kind of solve, isn't it? So just to kind of add to that, we've just had a question coming from Henry Leveson Gore, which I think kind of kind of adds to what we've just been talking about. And he asks, can you give a specific example of how the forces you talk about act to fuel the crisis?
I think one very recent example in COP26, for example, is how global South nations continue to be ignored. The Vulnerable 20 Forum, for example, so these are the most vulnerable 20 countries to particularly sea level rise. They're making demands ever since 2011 that have never been addressed or even looked at by the UN General Assembly in a serious enough way to actually address the emergency that they're experiencing. So we're talking really about ecofascism through allowing the climate crisis to essentially claim entire nations. That's one example of how these things work. And the mechanisms behind it are, there's a lot of references that I provide in my bit.ly that kind of start to, give you some clues as to where to start, to dig into those things, to find out for yourself. Because I don't think any one person can give you the answers. I think you have to look at it through different lenses and form your own opinions about it. But this is just one example that I'm bringing up that's very recent, and like we're, at the state of the emergency that we are now, and still we're seeing these kinds of patterns of behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point there. Henry's also asked another question, which is how does China fit into your account? Where does China come in all of this?
So I'm half Chinese, and my parents only met because of the British Empire and its exploits in Southeast Asia. So there is a lot of China in my history, in my educational history, in my blood, in my culture, etc. And I'm very concerned, of course, about China's intentions, let's say, as they go into the next 100 years of their political strategy in interacting with the world. China is a very difficult one to deal with because it's essentially the only major civilization that has lasted for, it's arguable, I say it's 9,000 years. In the way that it has done that is through understanding cultural evolution in a very strategic, precise, surgical way. So for me, in terms of climate, China's doing a lot. China's been thinking ahead for a long time about the climate, about how to adjust to the specific issues that it's currently facing. If you look at sea level rise projections in the different climate scenarios, China's the one that stands to lose the most. They're looking at displacement of their entire coastline. We're talking like, at the very least 70 to 100 million people along the Chinese coasts that have to be moved. This is something only I think the Chinese state government, no other government in the world, can organize and actually has experience in organizing because of their, as I said, long civilizational history, where they have a lot of accounts and a lot of experience essentially in managing not only social movements, but also just the logistics of all of this stuff. So in my opinion, China on the world stage is a very difficult beast to understand. And when you're looking from a Western lens with a very short-term sort of view on things, China can be seen as an adversary. And this is part of the propaganda of the West, because it wants to maintain different things about colonial hegemony from a European perspective. However, China itself is a colonizer. This is something that we must recognize. And it's not to say, I'm not trying to say that China's like, the best thing on earth, right? It's not. None, like no state is. I don't advocate for any states or any civilization, in fact. But China's activities with regards to, let's just talk about CO2, for example, or let's talk about biodiversity reinstatement, or let's talk about the management of water, seawater, as well as flooding, etc. I haven't seen people doing it better than China at the moment in terms of what the state actions are involved with. As for the other side of the coin, society and how Chinese society is dealing with these things, I do think that Chinese civilization has provided a very good foundation with which to allow community solidarity to be fostered and to bloom. I can't speak more than that because I don't live in China, and I'm sure they can speak for themselves much better than I can.
Brilliant, thank you. It was really, really interesting there to kind of hear about your different perspectives on things. And I suppose, you know, I was also aware as I studied geography, you know, aware of those actions that they're taking. But I suppose from a more like westernized perspective, you know, especially with COP, you know, we tend not to focus on that they're doing. And, you know, there's probably valuable lessons that a lot of nations can probably take from what China are doing. So yes, just in the meantime, if anyone else has any of the questions, please do keep them coming in the chat. It would be great to hear from you. I suppose then, do you think with what China is doing, do you think there's a lot more that other nations can be doing in response to the climate crisis? And do you think that you know, the New Deal that we have from COP26, do you think that is enough, you know, to kind of get us out of this crisis that we're in at the moment? Do you think, you know, there's more that could be a lot more that could be done in regard to that?
I think there's only one way for me to respond to that, and I think COP is the crisis. I think this agreement that had come out from COP26 is exactly the crisis. Like, if you want it on a piece of paper, there it is, you know? So with regards to what the UNFCCC should be looking at, I think it should start thinking about dissolving itself. I have no idea how else to say it. After 26 meetings, I think if we're not anywhere closer, then declare it a failure and like go back to the drawing board. It's ridiculous. There's also, with reference to the Western perspectives and China, for example, these are just geopolitical like powers, you know, hashing it out on a hegemonic level. But when you really zoom into this kind of splintering of worldviews that actually exist on the ground, particularly in the global south, then what you start to realize is that these one worlds are not listening at all. They're not interested in listening to anything except their own narratives. That's, I think, partially how the crisis perpetuates, whatever the crisis is. And the more we can move away from speaking and more to listening, especially listening to groups that have not been heard. And I don't mean just any group, you know, I mean really the groups that have been targeted and ethnocide is continuing to happen to them, you know, such as indigenous groups, like the urban poor, all the way, right the way across the global south. This is happening. Until we give them the center of the stage, that, I don't know, places like Global Conversations, where the WEF is designing conversations, nothing's really changing. We're just going to perpetuate civilization, and civilization comes with all these ills.
Yeah, like you say, you know, I think it's really important when these conversations are had. You know, a lot of the people that climate change directly impacts through, unfortunately, no real fault of their own. You know, a lot of indigenous communities, you know, the people that are most impacted by this weren't a lot of them weren't present at the talks, and you know, they're really key people who should have a say on these things, which I found was a drawback personally of COP26. So I'll just, in response to your answer about the China question, Henry Lewson-Gore's just kind of added a response to that, saying that, he totally agrees that China has been taking great steps, but many of your issues are about power and control, which they seem to use in a very centralized way, which could be categorized as fascist. So I suppose your thoughts kind of on that.
And I can say the same for the US, for Australia, for Europe. Let's not talk about the shambles that is the EU Parliament. I can say the same for any of these governments. That's the reason why I guess I'm advocating for all states to dissolve. Does that satisfy the question?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's also added another question in here as well, just saying, is there any other type of international meeting that would get the global south more heard, do you think?
This is a confusing question because it insinuates that the global south isn't already having international meetings. And be it South-to-South dialogues between states, or South-to-South dialogues between communities, or South-to-South dialogues between civil society organizations, they're happening. It's just whether you're looking for them and finding them and attending them and supporting the causes or not. So I don't know. I don't know what to say. Google search.
So I suppose then, so, as you kind of like point out that these conversations, they're already being had. It's just a case of, listening to them and actively kind of, wanting people's opinions and kind of working collectively. Do you think then, that things like COP26 and having these global talks, do you think that kind of format is still effective, or do you think it's just a case of, we just need to be inclusive of everyone and just recognize that? Do you think that COP26, if we did use it in the right way and we're hearing from everyone and everyone, no matter where they are in the world, is being involved, do you think it could probably be used for a greater cause?
No, I don't.
No.
I don't.
What do you think?
Well,
sorry.
What I've described essentially is the last 600 years that have led to our institutions being this way. So I don't think any such way to engage, like from the lead from these people, these organizations, I don't think any useful challenge to colonization or coloniality will emerge from that. And when we're talking about decolonial forums, they're local, they're plural, they're small, these are not for, I mean, there's definitely a role in allies and accomplices within the global north to self-organize to try to bring colonization, that topic, into these spaces, the centers of colonization themselves. But I think beyond that, there's no reason why anything should look like some kind of grand assembly of who's who, because this further just advances the narcissist agenda. Who else do you think will want to go to these things? Is it the introvert who sits alone and designs solutions or tries to get creative things going in their own backyard? Or is it the middle manager who wants a promotion and it wants a selfie at COP with that giant lit up globe?
Yeah, I mean, so how do you think then to kind of get around this if we're not going to have these, like COP26, these giant forums, you clearly, you don't think they're of much use in like tackling these problems that we have? Is there any other way that you think we can communicate together as like a global community, or do you think that, it should be more individualized, that countries should just be kind of focusing on themselves and making action in that way?
I think there's one major need I see as a so-called global community, which we are not. But at a global forum, I think there's one thing that's absolutely needed, and that's to talk about repatriation, giving back the stolen wealth. So when we talk about this 100 billion in climate resilience that's supposed to go to global South nations, and especially the vulnerable nations that are going to be suffering the most from climate change, that is nothing compared to the amount of wealth that has been stolen by the global North from the global South over the last 600 years. Repatriation is the only thing that needs to be tabled at these global forums. Everything else is distraction.
Thank you so much for that. I think we've got time for just one more question now, and this is from Henry. So he just asks, can you give examples of the local decolonialized forums and what they are achieving?
Sure. So on the 1st of December, West Papua is celebrating its flag raising day. This is one example of the forums that you can attend if you would like to. Possible Futures, we are supporting and engaging with a lot of different spaces for South to South connection, dialogue, exploration, etc. And there's many other groups who are doing the same. So I would highly recommend looking up Survival International as one of the groups who are based in the global North in Europe, but are highly, highly active at funding South to South dialogues, conversations, forums, and creating spaces also for challenge. So one example that Survival International held recently was their Our Land, Our Nature conference, which was on decolonizing conservation. And this was held in France during the time that the IUCN's World Conservation Congress was being held. This was probably about 6 weeks or 4 weeks ago or something like that. These are very local, but they're also very strategic, or trying to be strategic at being heard by the right people. They don't necessarily need to be heard by everyone in the world. Nobody is saying that you or me has the power to make these decisions, so why should we know about it, essentially? But also, there isn't a resource. They're not the UN. They don't have unlimited money coming in to be able to essentially target everyone, or to create this highly produced, sensationalistic event with all of these little social media sound bites, etc., to be able to entice you to join their conversation, particularly when they're talking about things that most of the developed world would kind of balk at, would really just kind of like, oh, these people, they're against us, they're drawing the line between us and them, without realizing that our entire systems are built to oppress the global South and marginalized folk in the global South. So there's many different examples. I can't speak to one place where you find them all. Obviously, that's the whole point. Divide and conquer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. So unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for today. It's time flies, eh? And it's been brilliant to talk to you, Samantha. Thank you so much. We'll be sharing with you the resources that Samantha spoke about in the chat. There'll be a link to her bit.ly, and you'll be able to find all of the resources that we've spoken today in the conversation. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Henry, for your questions. And thank you, Samantha, for being here. I didn't know whether there was just a message that you'd like to leave the audience with before we end the conversation today.
I'll leave it to you for that message, Penelope. What do you take away?
Brilliant. Well, I think, it's been really interesting, because I've been having these conversations the past few days with the Festival for Change. And I think it's just really interesting seeing the different perspectives. And, even with COP26, for a lot of people, they kind of saw this as the answer to a lot of these questions. And, you know, having these conversations the past couple of days, it's made me realise, you know, and solidify the fact that we still have a long way to go, and we really need to rethink about how we can do this together. So thank you so much, Samantha.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Cheers.